Hello, this is Professor Laird, and this is Chapter 3 of the Marriage and Family course, looking at variations of marriage and family life. And this is primarily a historical overview talking about the evolution of the marriage and family life, particularly in the U.S. society. So going back to the colonial period, before the Western Europeans had started to really come over, particularly in the 1500s into the 1600s, we had approximately 2 million Native Americans living in North America, broken up into about 240 different groups. By 1620, Jamestown, for example, one of the first colonies, imports English women to meet the demand that was provided by the men that were coming over. Very much influenced by Christianity, which one of the reasons why the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and among others, had come over from Europe was for religious freedom. It was also a patriarchal society, as most all societies were back then. Even to this day, all societies are generally patriarchal. At that time, the family served more of a social purpose to meet the needs of the community, not necessarily about romantic love, but more about duty to your spouse, duty to your husband, duty to your family. Family life was somewhat of a public phenomenon. At that time, land was really the most precious resource, and that's even reflected as we move up to our Constitution and our founding fathers. At the time of our founding of our country, that it was only white men with property that could actually vote. Wives were to submit to their husbands at this time. Children were pretty much put to use. There was no such thing or no term at that time as adolescence. And at a very agricultural-based society, children are put to work very early on. Also, families were very large with lots of children in order to help with that labor, working the land, as well as guarding against infant mortality, which was considerably higher back in those days. Looking at the slavery era, African American families by 1664, 40% of New Amsterdam, which is where New York City is now, consisted of slaves. They were legally prohibited from marrying, and children were often separated from their parents. But within these societal networks of the slave communities, they created their own marriages in informal ceremonies. As we get into the plantation era, they started to form two-parent families with children, even though they may not have been legally married. And this also provided somewhat of a support or a reaction against the indignities of being in labor or service in the slave system. As we get into the 1800s, we start to see some major transformations. The biggest, of course, is the Industrial Revolution, which you've touched on a couple of times already. That was the biggest period of technological innovation and industrial and economic development in human history, starting off particularly with the steam engine and then the railroads. Then post-Civil War, most all of the innovations that we enjoy today were developed during this period. The battery that's in your car, that technology was developed during this time. Internal combustion engine, major advances in medicine, refrigeration, indoor toilets, even flight during this period, just on and on and on. The innovations were enormous. As far as in the context of what we're talking about here, the main influence was this shift from an agricultural-based society more to an industrial manufacturing-based society. So we're seeing this shift from working the land on the farms to a wage-earning, urban-dwelling type of society. More movement towards the cities, more division of labor, where people would go and work jobs and get paid for those jobs, And this was also a major transformation in the structure of the family. Men were identified as the sole breadwinner as they go to work from their home. See, we have a major transition here where during the agricultural based society, working the farm, your home was your place of work. Now, as we move into the industrial based society, people go live in homes in the cities. The men leave their homes to go to work, and the women typically stay at home to be the caregivers, the family domestic roles. So those were really starting to get formed at this time. There's less parental authority in this respect since the father is gone most of the day. And this is when compulsory school and child labor laws started to form. The government started to take over this responsibility of educating our children. More in the 19th century, individual preferences were starting to supersede family considerations, starting to see some major transformations that women are more able to choose their spouse as we come out into this new family model here. The role as the housewife and the mother is also getting locked in. And at the same time, as we move from a farming-based society into the industrial-based society, fertility rate drops in half at that time because there's less incentive for the larger families. Also, as we go through the Industrial Revolution, the major advances in medicine are going to start to lower that possibility of infant mortality and improve our lifespans. So there's less need to have bigger families to guard against infant mortality. So a lot of things are happening here in this first major transformation of the Industrial Revolution. We also start to see the concept of a childhood, having a childhood, the childhood innocence, the formation of adolescence, since children are required to go to school rather than stay at home and work. And as I said, the school system is taking on that role, public good of education, of teaching our children. As far as the post-Civil War, during this period, the horrors of slavery acknowledged the resilience of the African American family, because as we said before, even under that system, they still formed their own families. After freedom, many vows were renewed to make it official, although few families were fully able to reunite because of how they were bought and sold and spread out. We're also starting to see waves of immigration. In the mid-1800s, from 1830 up until 1890, this is when we had our major Western and Northern European immigration coming from that period looking for more opportunity. Then we see another wave from the late 1800s to the early 1900s from the Eastern and Southern European areas, and those are not just for economic opportunity, but for more freedoms as well. There's a lot of oppressed areas that were looking for more freedom. Most of them were coming to the cities, so that was increasing the larger unskilled, cheap labor pool of workers, and they also were clustering in their own informal networks in these cities along their ethnic lines from where they came from in Europe. As we get into the 20th century, yet more shift as we become a more progressive, more prosperous society, where family is becoming less of a function of a social role, and now it's becoming, since we have a more prosperous in general society, then the family starts to center more on meeting the emotional needs of its members. And this is where we come up with the original notions of a companionate marriage, to where the husband and wife then share decision making, share tasks, even though there are very defined roles in the families as far as the male roles and the female roles. We'll get into that more later on when we talk about gender and how that's certainly changing quite a bit over the last several decades. But here in this period, as we get early on in the 20th century, the family and marriage is a little bit more driven by romance, sexual fulfillment, children are given yet even more freedom because we're starting to see more compulsory laws that prevent child labor and requirements for school. The Great Depression, sparked by the stock market crash of 1929, the economic depression and the United States reaction to that, the government's role in trying to alleviate the depression, was another major landmark event that shifts or changes the family a little bit more. The government starts to assume more responsibility in taking care of people. So prior to this, the family was kind of obligated to take care of their elders. Now we start to see social insurance, Social Security, unemployment, more resources for child care. So as a result of the Depression, and particularly the New Deal government policies that were trying to alleviate the Depression and provide a little bit more government support for those who are hurt by economic crash, then that also starts to have effects on family life as well, particularly as what families had been obligated to do before, a little bit less so now that we're getting into more of the what we call the welfare state. World War II was another major event. Even though a lot of this was temporary, women filled non-traditional roles because of all the men going off in the war effort. The women then made a fairly brief transition into the workforce. One of the more famous icons from that period is Rosie the Riveter, representing women going to the factories and actually helping to build the airplanes in the war effort. During that period, almost half of American women held a job at some point during the war. Now, after the war, we have another interesting confluence of events. During World War II, enormous expense was undertaken in order to win that war effort, and that resulted in a massive amount of productive capacity. We also had men going to war and getting paid, but yet not spending that. So we had a lot of savings pent up there. And then when we get out of the war, we have a lot of demand. We have the GI Bill. So we have more people going to college on the GI Bill. And then we started to see, because of this dawning of the golden age of capitalism, we're seeing more people able to afford more consumer products. And we're starting to build this healthy, large, robust middle class. To give you an example, before the war, very few people had cars. After the war, within a generation, everybody had a car. Before the war, nobody had a TV set. Wasn't even invented yet. After the war, as we get into the early 60s, everybody has a TV set. So the same thing over and over, refrigerators, washer dryers, you name it. There was just so much consumer demand for these products that more and more people could now afford to buy. So this was the golden age of capitalism that lasted up until the early 1970s. This is where the classic traditional family really got molded in, where the husband would work, the wife would stay at home. The idea of this middle class American dream where everybody could be relatively successful. There was an unmatched aura of stability, and that stability then served to lock in these gender roles of the husband going to work, getting his carpool with his lunch pail and going to work, mom staying home, taking care of the families and doing the domestic chores. These you can even look at the films and even some of the documentaries from the 1950s, and you can see how obvious these societal roles were becoming so defined. Childbearing actually starts to increase post-war. This is what we call the post-war baby boom. Because of all the men coming home from the war, prosperity starts to increase and the birth rate spikes somewhat. The divorce rate also starts to decrease at that time because of this stability and prosperity, relative prosperity. See other things starting to come about, particularly with the development of the welfare state as far as a society that is relatively successful and prosperous, then takes pride in trying to take care of its people who are living in poverty or not able to take advantage of the economic system. Now, the major transitions that we're looking at today had, for the most part, their beginnings in the 1960s or so. This is an interesting part of this in the aftermath, or perhaps a product of the golden age of capitalism. As we get into the 60s, as we become more prosperous society, we're starting to try to take care of our people and building the welfare state. Well, we're also becoming more socially active, where we're thinking about civil rights, we're thinking about women's rights, we're thinking about the environment. A lot of things are starting to come to fore in the 1960s because in a very successful post-consumerist type society, then you start to think about other problems as well. This is where we start to see increasing dual earner households. As we get to the 70s, the golden age of capitalism starts to play out. At some point, everybody's got a car, everybody's got 2 TV sets. So therefore, the demand for consumerism starts to slow down, as you might expect. We also have to pay for that welfare state. We also were in expensive war in the 1960s. So all of these things start to come together to slow down this golden age of capitalism. And as a result, the corporate powers, the corporate influences start to shift their gears and say, well, now we've got to come up with other ideas to maximize our profit now that this golden age of capitalism is starting to play out. We also see a lot of financial crises during the 1970s. But what is the trend here is that starting in the 1970s, the corporate interests start to look at ways to increase their profit. And this was to lower wages. This was to outsource labor to other countries, hold down the minimum wage, things like that. And as a result, those relatively high-paying jobs that were almost overwhelmingly male jobs in the manufacturing sector and the industrial sectors, those started to go away, and those wages started to stagnate. So that's part of what's happening as we come out of the golden age of capitalism into the 70s. There's more need for dual earner households in order to maintain that same standard of living in the wake of a depressed real wage that has not increased in accordance with our GDP. Cohabitation also starts to increase. In the early 70s, it was relatively uncommon. Now nearly half of women, 15 to 44, have cohabitated. Married couples now head less than half of U.S. households for the first time ever. And I mentioned that on the first lecture that a couple of years ago, we passed that threshold where there are more Americans that are not married than there are Americans that are married. About half of over 25s who have ever divorced are currently remarried. So we start to see increases in remarriages, second marriages. So those are some major trends that started to form 60s and the 70s. Another trend is we're seeing more single parents. Talk more about this later on. About 40% of births in recent years were to unmarried women. We've also been seeing a larger percentage of teen births in that group as well. Almost half of the U.S. population over 18s are unmarried. Now, that doesn't mean that they'll never be married, but there are more people unmarried at any one time. Also, we've talked about how U.S. marriages now start later than ever before. Those median ages of first marriage have risen quite significantly since the 1960s. What are the factors influencing this change? I've already touched on some of them. Women, because they have more choices as we get in the 60s and the 70s, women start to see more choices. There's more need for them to go to work. There's more opportunities for women to go to work. So therefore, women are dependent on men and on marriage. That's also going to influence the divorce rate, as we'll see here in a bit. The lack of the real wage increase, as I already talked about, how that came about with outsourcing, globalization, technological development, that automation that would put more of these industrial and manufacturing type jobs out of work. So a lot of, it's not about the bad guys versus good guys here. There's a lot of things happening in a capitalist society that is going to have influences here, so that lack of real wage increases the need for more dual earners. I've already talked about the technological developments, transportation developments, communication developments, increases the ability for contacts and choices, and increases the service sector. The contraception was also a factor in having fewer children, because now women in particular have a little bit more ability to plan their families, along with education and awareness, knowledge of reproductive incentives or assistance. These are things that are happening, that are all working to give women more choices in the workforce, to lower birth rates, to increase divorce rates. We're also getting older as we have more technological and medical developments, causing difficulties, as we'll talk about here a little bit later on. If people are still retiring at the same age of 65, but yet living longer, then we're having more people that are working that are having to contribute to the social insurance. When Social Security was formed back in 1936, the average lifespan at that time was 58 years old. So it was a money-making proposition at that time. However, now our average lifespan is around 78. So now we're seeing to where increasingly as we go, that if people are still retiring at that same age, we may start seeing that more and more people will actually get back from the social insurance more than they paid in during 40 years of employment. Increased divorce, we'll talk about that here in a second. Decreased fertility, we've already talked about first of all, as we came out of the agricultural based society, there's less need for more children. There's more choices for women to have jobs in lieu of having larger families, or having jobs instead of staying home and taking care of children. The gender roles also start to shift around this time as well. More women in the workforce as a result. Also, more stay-at-home dads. That's a still relatively small percentage, but these are some of the shifts that we'll be talking about throughout the course. Here we're looking at these historical factors as to what's going on. The growing social acceptance of divorce, again, had its roots in the 1960s. We started to see more liberal divorce laws, where there was no-fault divorce or the irreconcilable differences clause, to where it was easier to get a divorce. Also, with increasing prosperity, as we're in the peak of the golden age of capitalism, as we get into the 60s, more families can afford to get a divorce if they feel like they want that. Now, if you have smaller families, if you have fewer children, then it's more practical to get a divorce. Or if you have no children, it's probably a little easier to make that decision to get a divorce. Women, as I've already said, less dependent on a spouse, so that's also going to increase the potentials for divorce. All of these are coming together around that time. And if you have these other choices, then you've got more alternatives to being unhappy. If you're in a marriage that you're not happy in, then you've got perhaps more incentives to divorce. And as a result of that, as we get out of the 60s into the 70s, it becomes more of a social acceptance of divorce, because even when I was a kid, divorce was kind of considered, well, that's not something you're supposed to do, right? Well, now it's it's just kind of like a common fact of life. Again, there's negative consequences to divorce, and we'll talk about all those things, all those factors, all those long-term studies that I've talked about before. But still, the acceptance of divorce has almost shifted 180 degrees since that time. Now let's talk just for a few minutes about the social class aspects that are kind of at the heart of a lot of our statistical findings here, regardless of where you live or what ethnic group you may be a member of. At the root of this is the socioeconomic status that tends to affect most of these trends. About 1% of this is the 1%ers here owns about a third of all the assets in the United States, more wealth than the 90% at the bottom, so to speak, combined. So that shows a pretty large wealth and income disparity in the United States. Middle class that is measured anywhere from about 40 to 80,000 a year income is about 30 to 35% of the population, and there's lots of data showing that the middle class is shrinking, which is kind of the opposite of what we had during the golden age of capitalism, where we had a very healthy, large, robust middle class that was very beneficial to the economy. The working class average about 40,000 a year, is 30% of the population. The working poor, which is also showing to be increasing, and about 20% of the children in the United States live in poverty. So this is some interesting statistics in a country that is the most wealthy, powerful country in the world and still has these numbers. New terminology as far as the lower income strata. The underclass, particularly in the inner cities, is disproportionately African American and Latino. The lower income does tend to affect these demographics, these statistics that we'll be talking about more than anything else, but yet we also have to keep in mind that the greater proportion of the lower income are the minorities. So that's where that connection comes in. There's still discrimination that the minorities are facing, and the lower income are also victims of outsourcing. Since schooling is pretty much a function of where you live, housing, nutrition, the lower income have a substantially less educational opportunities. That when you look at the differences in the lifespan between lower income Americans and the higher income Americans, it's pretty dramatic as far as the average lifespan because of the confluence of these factors here of less opportunities for education, less nutrition. As far as poverty goes, about 1/2 of the U.S. population might require assistance at some point in their lives. We already know that almost 1/2 of Americans don't even pay a net income tax. And that's not because they have sharp lawyers that can get them out of paying income tax. No, that's because they're not making enough money. 41% of single mother families are below the poverty line. Middle class family increasingly requiring dual income in order to stay middle class. We've already talked about why that is. Marriage least stable among the lower classes because of these socioeconomic factors. They are also more likely to be single parents. Children of affluent parents face different but just as stressful pressures. So this is some things that we'll talk about later on. There are pressures that may not necessarily be based on socioeconomic status. It's all relative. The socioeconomic class affects parenting styles, whether or not you stress more autonomy, self-discipline, or extracurricular activities. The recession did have some effects as well. Increase in domestic homicides during that period, increase in the number of women seeking help at domestic violence shelters. There was even a further delay in childbearing. There was a downsizing in the number of children because of that economic recession. Additional 3 million children added into the poverty, and an increase in children living with a grandparent in order to help make ends meet. So looking at race, ethnicity, minority groups, race is a social construction based on physical characteristics of skin color and facial traits, and these are largely due to long-term adaptation to climate. But it's very important to us in our human sensibilities. That's why we tend to group up with people that look like us and think like us. But interestingly, there are more differences within groups of humans than there are between groups of people. All humans have the same common ancestors. DNA has shown this, that all of the humans in the world today descended from a relatively small group of hunter-gatherers as recent as about 150,000 years ago in north central Africa. So race is, there are certain differences in ethnic identities that we can touch on, but particularly in America, the social construction of race has been pretty well documented. A group is first defined based on its physical characteristics, which should be the color of their skin or their facial traits. Then this physical difference is then used to imply hereditary or behavioral differences, and those start to take hold. Those are then used to justify social differentiation, and this is where racism, discrimination would still persist. It still persists today because of these long-standing constructions of race, particularly in the United States. And as a result, then it becomes a real factor in shaping our life experiences because of our socialization into the system where we have created this concept of race. Ethnicity has got deeper roots, could be a shared cultural pattern of history, language, religion, customs, national origin, shared experiences of oppression or domination. This is what we would call a culturally homogeneous population. Ethno-nationalism is one of the biggest sources of conflict in the world today. We won't have much time to touch on it in this class, but this is a desire for a nation state that matches your specific culture, because there's lots of ethnic identity groups that are broken up between countries, or that they're forced to coexist with other groups within countries, primarily during that long period of colonialism in the aftermath of that. But this is very important in defining group identity, from extended kinship, clans, resulting in in-group bias. This is just an example. Prior to the breakup of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia was a country about the size of Texas, but it was kind of held together like a pressure cooker, a very authoritarian control. And then after the breakup of the Soviet Union, then Yugoslavia, the leadership top blows off of that as well. And then it breaks up into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different countries because of the separation of the ethnic identity groups within that country. So that gives you a pretty good example of how humans will break off into their identity groups given that option. Even Bosnia-Herzegovina is kind of bickering at this point, looking at perhaps splitting up over those two groups as well. Minority groups, that status puts them at an economic, social, and political disadvantage, and that is typically defined by this race, particularly in America, or ethnicity in countries where the ethnic identity is so important to those groups of people. 40% of the U.S. population is minority groups, and by 2060, over half of the population will be minorities. You can see those in figures 3.2. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on. Marriage characteristics vary between groups to a certain extent, but primarily socioeconomic status, as I said before, is kind of the underlying factor that provides the differences in these demographics. Looking at families and ethnicity, despite the slight variations in parenting, socialization, and traditions from group to group. It's the class differences, as I said, the socioeconomic status that tends to have the greater effect. And then, of course, we see that minority groups tend to make up the higher portion of the lower income groups there. So that's why that correlation exists. White, blacks, and Latinos with similar income and similar educations tend to have similar patterns of involvement with their extended families. So that shows you again how that underlying factor of socioeconomic status seems to be prevalent throughout the demographics that we'll talk about in this class. Okay, so this wraps up chapter 3. There was quite a bit to talk about here, looking at the variations of marriage and family, particularly how it's evolved over the years to where we are now. So stay tuned for discussion forum.